We are now going to move on to the final keynote, and closing us out today is Jason Warner. He's the CTO of GitHub, and he will be talking about architecting teams that scale.
Hey everybody, welcome to the final 15 minutes of the day. Thanks for being here. And we're going to talk about architecting teams at scale. And we have a lot of slides to get through, so I will do my best to do this as quickly as possible. Though I do encourage everyone to go look at the appendix. There's going to be a lot of information that we talk about in here that is not going to be discussed in depth, but is worth exploring on your own. And here we go. So architecting teams at scale. I am the current CTO of GitHub. I've been at GitHub for about 4 years now. And before GitHub, I was at Heroku. And before Heroku, I was at Canonical. People make Ubuntu Linux. And before we go too in-depth in this, I do want to call out that a lot of what I will be talking about here is the culmination of the last 10 years of my life, building organizations, particularly dev-focused, dev tools organizations that need to deliver product to people around the world at scale. And while this is fun to talk about, there's a lot of things in here that could be applicable for everyone around the world, but also might be specific to the types of companies that I worked at, some high growth venture-backed startups. So what do we mean by scale? What do we mean and what we don't mean? Well, we do not mean technical in this conversation. Yes, this is CTO craft. Yes, we're talking to the CTO of GitHub, but this is not about which databases or how scale Rails frameworks or any of those sorts of things. But what we do actually mean by scale in this case is all the human factors: scheduling, planning, how to organize teams, how to get the most out of people, how to inspire people, all of those things. That's what we mean by scale. And why that's important, because as people managers or as people in organizations trying to get things done, most of our day actually feels like this picture. This is a very good representation of what I feel that most high growth startups actually do on a day in, day out basis. At the root of it, it's about prioritization. You have to understand what the highest leverage point of value to be working on every day is. And you have to hope that most people in your organization know that too. And that's actually the job, is helping people understand where they should be spending their time and energy. Because most of what we do is actually feeling like this. It's herding people towards a goal. It's herding cats, herding people. And we have to make people understand what they're supposed to be working on. We're supposed to understand all about the goals, all about the company, all about the long-term objectives. And it's easier when the organization is working towards that. It's harder when there is no real objectives. And that's the point of the whole herding cats mentality. Cats meander. That's what they do. They walk around. Organizations do that too. If you are not structured in your approach to building and scaling organizations, you don't know what's going to happen inside your company. So let's keep going a little bit and get into the meat of this. A friend a long time ago gave me this, and I love it, and I keep this in my slide decks no matter what I do. But there's two types of people in the world, he said. There's poets and there's librarians. And you never want a librarian doing a poet's job, and you never want a poet doing a librarian's job. And yes, on the grand scale between poets and librarians, everyone falls at some point on that spectrum naturally. But then even more, relative to somebody else, you might look more like a librarian, and relative to another person, you might look more like a poet. And an example of this, in San Francisco, I look very much like a poet for a CTO, but in some parts of the world, I very much look like a librarian. It's just, you look very different in the context. But in the context of the poets and librarian spectrum, we also need to take into consideration the spectrum of scale. And what do I mean by scale? Well, the spectrum of scale goes from 2 people in a garage with a dog all the way to 5,000 people in a publicly traded company on Wall Street. And that spectrum, obviously, there are no set rules between any of those phases. The only thing that really does have a rule is that nothing will be the same as you grow. So the things that made 2 people in a garage with a dog successful to get funding won't be true with 10 people, and definitely won't be true with 50 people. And as you get to 500 and 5,000, those days have long been forgotten. And if you understand that what got you to a certain point will not keep you and definitely won't help you get to the next point, then you fully understand what is happening along the spectrum of scale. And more importantly than the fact that what you did won't take you to the next spot, what we do need to understand is that, again, this is not technical. This is all people. This is architecting people systems, architecting organizational groups, architecting communication pathways. If we're talking about architecting teams for scale, we're actually talking about communication. So for today, for the next 9 minutes and 40 seconds on my countdown clock, I need everyone to be poets and suspend disbelief about technical construction or language and framework selection and all of those things, because ultimately those won't matter nearly as much as everything that we're talking about here today. So before I go too far, I do need to give 2 caveat slides, the culture slide and the technology slide. So this is the culture caveat slide. The only thing I really want to mention here about this is that you will have a culture whether you explicitly want to spend time on it or not. So I suggest you explicitly spend time on it, because then it might be the one that you're after. And then the technology culture slide. And yes, I said this is not a technology talk. It is not. However, technology can and will hold back your organization at some point, in all likelihood. Technology and code, as weird as it sounds coming from the CTO of GitHub, does not have a right to life. It should serve business. It should serve the broader, greater objective of the organization. So as you think about technology, think of it in that construct. Is this serving us? Do we have what we need to scale? Do we have what we need for the next phase? That is where technology really needs to be in this proper place. So because we only have 8 minutes and 24 seconds now on the time remaining clock for the 15 minutes we were allotted for this, we're only going to talk about the boulders today, and the boulders, rocks, pebbles, sand approach. And the rocks, pebbles, and sand will be in the appendix. And while they're very important on their own, the boulders make the basis of great organizations. And if you can nail the boulders, you're long on your way to becoming a great organization. So what are they? The boulders are what I call the must-haves. If you do nothing else in your organization, spend time on these. And if you're early in your organization, this is where you should be spending your time. If you think about this in terms of funding levels, if you're a seed or pre-seed stage company, these are things that you should be working on, not the later stage stuff, the rocks, pebbles, and sand. Those come later. And as you take that spectrum of scale over, you can move on to some of the other ones, which will become more optimizing. Sand, as an example, in the boulders, pebbles, rock, and sand would be optimizing, whereas boulders are obviously non-negotiables. So what are these? Well, obviously they're pretty simple words on a page, but what do all 6 of these really mean? Well, mission and vision is quite literally, what are we supposed to be in the fullness of time? When we are a very successful company and everyone in the world understands what we are and what we do, what are we and what are we doing? Just write it down. What is the mission and vision? Who are the customers you're serving? Why are you serving them? What will you have changed? What will you have done in the world? It's very easy to say. It's a little bit harder to do once you actually put pen to paper on that one. Principles and practices are a little bit more tactical than mission and vision, but I do think that they're at the right stage here in the boulders. Principles are rather enduring, and practices are things that might change over time, but principles are about who you are as an organization. Are you going to optimize for speed? Are you going to optimize for empathy? Are you going to optimize for customer happiness? Pick 5 to 7 of these things and talk about what your principles are as an organization. And then practices are the things that are going to help you achieve those things for your stage. So as an example, your principles are going to be about your customer at one stage, and you need to get speed to market because you are very early in your career, in your company life cycle. But as you get to Salesforce side, you still might have the customer as the main principle, but the practice is now holistic 360 listening tours around the world because you've got Fortune 10 companies. Very different practice. Completely inappropriate for an earlier stage, but completely appropriate for Salesforce's side. Context is one that I see missed very often. Context is just being able to articulate why. What, why, and how. So any decision that comes down, if you don't give the why and the reasoning around this, many times that the rationale for that decision will be lost, and then it'll look like a tactical decision. And then the spirit of that decision or the program will be lost. Context is what endures. So This is something that takes some practice to get to. It's not natural for most people to give context. It feels like just do what I said is the appropriate level of context. That is not. The organization can't grok just do what I said. They need to fully understand the context. The last three, expectations, measurables, and authenticity, are really straightforward, particularly measurables, but I want to emphasize one thing in each one of these. Expectations are also about what you do and what you're not going to do. So what you do, we expect that we're going to release many times a week. We expect that we're going to have customer conversations. We expect we're going to do certain things. Also, we expect that we're not going to go do certain things. We're not going to have faults in production, or we're not going to have downtime. We're not going to have. So write down the expectations. It's a very crisp way to say what should and shouldn't be in the world. Measurables are obviously just how are we doing as a business, but I do not believe in being a data-driven business. I just don't believe that that is a factually accurate statement about what happens in the world. I believe that the more zeitgeisty approach of data-informed is the way to run a business. And data-informed means you actually have to have that data, but you do have to start measuring it. I also believe that you shouldn't measure too much. 3 to 5 main measurements for your business are great. Same thing for every division. If you can measure a couple of things and understand how it's going to impact the rest of your life, better. Don't measure 20 things. No one's going to look at a 20-thing chart. Have that in the appendix or have that in a subsequent chart. And then authenticity. I think the best businesses are run in an authentic manner. This is more of a leadership trait than it is a business trait, but I do believe in this one very, very deeply. So let's keep going. So let's talk about one last must-have. This required process slide that we're talking about here is that most people, when they want to get into organizations, they actually want to talk about how things will get done. How do we go to market? How do we develop software? How do we do all that sort of stuff? And I'm going to tell you that process is all well and good, but if you spend too much time on process, you will lose sight of why you have a business in the first place. So here's what I would recommend you think about when you're talking about process. What we do, how we do it, and on what time horizon are we going to do it? Then, how do we know we're achieving these objectives, and how are we validating these with the customers? Everything else after that is actually less important than the holistic view of why a process exists in the first place. Word of caution, anyone who's telling you you need XP, Scrum, Agile, you must have burned down charts, all of that, likely doesn't fully understand why those are important. And you do need to run to why certain things and processes are important. If you can understand the meta of a process and the meta of why Agile was a big deal, then you have a good shot at making a process for your organization. Okay, if you're building a startup, or you're building a high growth company, or you're building a team or a division, I do believe this as well. You should drive to having one world-class person in your team, your company, or your organization. This is hard for a lot of people to really think about because, particularly founders like to think of themselves as that one world-class person or the several world-class people. I do believe that you do just need one in your organization as a starting, but you must have at least one. And I very much recommend that it not be a founder. In fact, I do believe that if a founder thinks of themselves as that world-class person, but they cannot attract other people who are in fact better than them, they are not in fact a world-class person. And why I also don't think that the founder should be the one world-class person that they're banking on inside the organization is that they're not actually making a resilient organization or company at that point. I can't live past the founders. So I think the board has a duty, in fact, to think of world-class people joining the organization that are not founders. So, under a minute, let's see if I can get through these. These are the takeaway slides. One of my favorite quotes of all time. Simply, if you can drive your organization to discuss ideas instead of events or people, you have a shot at being a great organization. Most organizations end up discussing events, and very below average to toxic organizations discuss people. It's as simple as that. It's almost a universal physical law at this point, given my purview of advising and being on boards and investing in companies. If I find that the founders or the early employees talk about ideas on a regular basis as opposed to events or people, they've got a shot. And all the world-class organizations are discussing ideas at their earlier stages. And yes, most world-class organizations eventually become mediocre organizations that exclusively talk about events. It's just a natural law. The more time you can spend in ideas, the better shot you have of being a world-class organization. Your culture, worst behavior of a leader is going to tolerate, that is what your culture is going to become. You think of this as the low bar. And so if you can't synthesize this and you can't take this into a day in, day out basis, it's going to be very difficult for you to have a world-class organization, and you're not going to scale either. You need to balance two modes. You need to balance becoming a sociologist and a psychologist. Leaders, you need to spend more time as a sociologist. And by that, I mean you need to care after the whole. You can have an individual conversation with a person across the table from them about their hopes and dreams, but you cannot make a decision for the entire company, team, or organization based upon that person's hopes and dreams. You can care after that person's hopes and dreams as an individual with them, but you can't make a decision for the organization based upon those. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time, and I'm going to go back to these last two. What we do and how we do it defines what most organizations are going to be at any one stage. What we do, we release software at speed. How we do it by caring after people. We do it in open and transparent ways. What we do and how we do it becomes your cultural vanguard. Be explicit in this, and then your organization will start defining its culture around these principles. And with that, be explicit about that. Be explicit what you're optimizing for. If you're optimizing for speed or revenue retention or hiring, be explicit about it. Understand what you're optimizing for at any one time. Otherwise, you will have implicit decisions made for you. And this goes to the last point. You need to do things when you want to do them, not when you are told to do them, either by your technical architecture, your board because you're running out of money, or your customers because they start demanding it to you. Control your destiny more than anything. Do things one step ahead of when you're forced to do it by the realities of the market or your technology. I'm going to skip a bunch of these slides for the sake of time, but this one is one worth pointing out. I think I made a mistake earlier in my career that I wanted to be a lot less date-driven than I thought was actually necessary. And I think that's because my natural proclivity is to not be date-driven. I can be demanding of myself, and I can do things in time when I need to do them. But I actually think dates are good, and I think dates and constraints are incredibly useful to build your organization around. And the singular reason why is they are immalleable physical laws of the universe. Every organization has the same time constraint. Every organization cannot bend that. There is no unlevel playing field here. Everyone, the 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 365 days in a year are the same for everyone. Use the constraints, use that. It's the one thing that no one has a discrete advantage on. So let's skip these slides, and I'm just going to go to the pebbles, rocks, and sands and end here. In the appendix, we have the rocks, pebbles, and sand, and what we're going to cover in these slides are things to add, remove, worry about, or ignore. I do encourage you to go back and spend some time in this, in the appendix, and just to see that. But if you can go back and look for the last 15, well, I guess 17 minutes at this point, and go back over the boulders and really synthesize those and work those through, you've got a shot at being an escape velocity world-class organization. Time and time again, I've seen that those boulders are where most organizations will trip up. And in fact, and the high growth ones have probably nailed those at the root, and everything else becomes optional. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference, and hope to see you online sometime in the future.